There is a moment in Slate work that tells you almost everything about an office. Someone asks what sounds like a simple question. How many admitted students from New Jersey attended an event and still have not deposited? Which applicants are missing material, but only for programs where the material is actually required? How many students first entered through the source, and how many of them eventually enrolled? The questions sound straightforward, but then the room pauses. Not because the questions are unimportant, because everyone knows the answer depends on who builds the query. One person starts on person, another starts on application. Someone filters on a rank 1 address and accidentally misses the address they needed. Someone exports all addresses but filters on only one address and cannot explain why the results look wrong. Someone says we should use a subquery. Someone else says why. And then that one Slate person who really understands configurable joins, they become the whole reporting strategy. That's the problem for today. Not that queries are hard, they are, but the bigger problem is that query knowledge is often concentrated in too few people, even though the institution depends on the results. If your team depends on one person to understand the joins, you don't have a reporting strategy, you have a bottleneck. And I'll let folks read the goal on bottlenecks. Today's episode is about what I'm calling the query ladder. The question's simple. What level of query literacy should Slate professionals actually have? Not everyone needs to become an advanced Slate developer. That's not the argument. But more people need enough query literacy to understand what question they are asking, what one row is supposed to represent, where the data lives, and when the output might be misleading. This episode is based on 5 Slate Summit sessions. Fantastic Data and Where to Find It, Demystifying Tables, Joins, and Relationships, presented by Christy from Linfield University and Claire from Enrollment Fuel. Yes, you need to know configurable joins, a beginner's guide to configurable joins, presented by Danielle, Paula from Post Captain Consulting, and Laura from Westchester University Graduate Admissions. A join named Sue by Charles from the University of Chicago. But Why Subqueries by Jason from University of Scranton Graduate Admissions. And Technolutions Training, Query Grab Bag, an assortment of next-level querying techniques presented by Luis and Max from Technolutions. Those sessions move from beginner-friendly mental models to very advanced query techniques. My goal is not to recreate them. My goal is to connect them into a practical learning path. Because the summit pattern is clear. Query literacy is not a niche skill anymore. It's part of the craft base for modern Slate work. Welcome to the Conference Insight Engine, presented by the Innovation Forge. I'm David Dysart, and this series is about turning summit materials into interpretation and application. The first episode argued that advanced Slate work is becoming decision infrastructure, not just reports and portals, campaigns, scores, rules, and dashboards, but actual systems that help institutions make better decisions. This second episode is about one of the core skills underneath that work. Querying. That may sound technical, and it is, but this is not an episode only for technical users. And actually, I think that is one of the traps. When offices treat query logic as something only the technical person needs to understand, they create a fragile operating model. The director trusts a dashboard, but can't explain its base. The counselor gets a list, but does not know who is excluded. The communication team sends to an audience, but does not know what join logic built the population. The analyst even inherits a query and has to guess why it was built that way. The Slate captain leaves, and suddenly the instance feels less like a forge and more like an archaeology site. So today, I want to build a ladder. Not everyone has to climb to the top, but everyone should know which rung they are standing on. A Slate query is rarely just a query. It's often the foundation of a decision. It decides who gets an email, who appears on a counselor list, who's counted in a dashboard, who triggers a role, who is included in an export, which students are considered engaged, and which records are missing something important. That means query logic becomes institutional logic. If the query is wrong, well, the institution may not just have a bad report. It may send the wrong message, miss the wrong students, overcredit the wrong source, undercount the wrong population, misunderstand the funnel, or even make a decision with confidence it has not earned. That is why query literacy matters. Less to admire beautiful joins, and more to the fact that query logic determines what the institution sees. And what the institution sees determines what it does. The beginner sessions are important because they start where the work actually starts. Fantastic data and where to find it from Christy and Claire is useful because it grounds the learner in Slate's data world, where data lives, what tables are, how records relate to each other, and why relationships matter. The practical lesson I take from that session is that we have to choose the correct base first. We have to understand the one-to-many relationships. We should prefer the direct paths where possible, use the almanac, label joins clearly, and build queries that are not just functional, but understandable. This isn't the advanced Slate wizardry. This is basic craft discipline. And yes, you need to know configurable joins from Danielle, Laura, and Paula. Reinforces that concept that I think every Slate office should teach early. It's what they call row grain. Row grain is the answer to this question. What should one row represent? One person, or is it one application? Is it one decision, one address, one event registration, one interaction, or just one material? If the team cannot answer that before building, the query is already in trouble. A lot of messy reports come from skipping the step. You ask a person-level question, but start on applications. You ask an application-level question, but export person-level fields. You ask whether someone has a Massachusetts address, but you also want to export every address. You ask how many students attend an event, but you accidentally count registrations, event instances, or just duplicate rows. And that's not just a technical mistake. It's a decision mistake. The row grain defines what the institution thinks it's counting. So the first real move on the query ladder is not what join do I need. The first move is what does one row mean? Once you answer that, the next move becomes choosing the right base. A query base is not a neutral starting point. If you start on person, one row generally represents a person. If you start on an application, one row generally represents an application. If you start on a decision, well, you guessed it, one row generally represents a decision. This matters because Slate is full of one-to-many relationships. One person can have many applications. One application can have many materials. One person can have many addresses. And one event can have many registrations. One school can connect to many students. One person can have many interactions. If you do not think about the base, you can accidentally multiply rows, flatten rows, hide rows, or select one arbitrary row from many. This is where a lot of people learn the hard way. They export a field, the count looks too high, they add a filter, the count changes in a way they cannot explain, they remove a join, everything breaks. Then the query gets copied, renamed, and reused for 3 years. And that's how Slate instances acquire ghosts. The practical rule is simple. Choose the base that matches the thing you want one row to represent. Then write that down. Put it in the query description or whatever documentation system you have. This query is person-based because the communication should send once per person. This query is application-based because the process applies separately to each application. The query is decision-based because we are analyzing decisions, not people. That one sentence prevents a lot of future confusion. The next step is understanding the path you are using to reach the data. Beginner users do not need to know every advanced query technique on day one, but they do need to understand the difference between a clean direct relationship and a relationship that creates multiple possible rows. This is where advice from the fantastic data becomes very practical. Choose direct paths where possible. Label the joins clearly. Build something another person can inherit. A join label is not just a label. It's a note for future you. It says, I knew what relationship I was using, This was intentional, and this was the path I meant. That matters because Slate often gives you multiple paths to similar looking information. An application school, a person school, a rank 1 school, an educational history join may not all mean the same thing. An address joined at the main level and an address summarized through a subquery are not the same thing. A current value and a historical value are not the same thing. The craft move is not to memorize every possible path. The craft move is to slow down enough to ask what relationship you're using, whether it's direct, whether it's one-to-one, and what Slate is doing if there are many possible rows. That phrase is important. Many possible rows. This is where Jason's "but why" subqueries become central. The title is useful because it captures the learner's frustration perfectly. Not which button do I click, but why do I have to do this? The practical reason is that one-to-many data does not behave like one big flat table. If your base row is one person, but that person has many addresses, you have to decide what the query should do with those addresses. Should it choose one, count them, test whether any exists, concatenate them, aggregate them, filter based on them, while keeping the person row intact? Subqueries are one way Slate lets you inspect related rows without corrupting the base of the query. That's my phrasing, but it captures the practical lesson I see across these sessions. A subquery lets you ask questions like, does this person have any address in a region? How many applications does this person have? Does this application have any missing required materials? What is the most recent event attended? Does this student have an interaction matching a specific type? Without subqueries, people often face and force one-to-many data into a one-row expectation and then wonder why the output is strange. So the skill is not simply become a subquery expert. The skill is recognizing the pattern. I am asking something about many related rows, so I probably need a structure designed for many rows. That recognition alone is a major step. From there, the ladder gets more advanced. Charles, a joy named Sue, as I can't get past the song, gets into the situations where Slate does not naturally know two things are related in the way your business process needs them to be related. The session teaches how to create a business-defined relationship using independent subqueries and comparison exports. The session calls this a Sue join. I am not going to recreate the technical build here. That belongs to the session, and it deserves careful study. But the strategic idea is powerful. Sometimes the relationship you need is not a native relationship in Slate. The institution knows two things should be compared. Slate may not have a built-in join that says these belong together, so the advanced builder creates a controlled comparison. The examples in the session include a guest-to-host self-join for an overnight event and a program management dataset joined to application by program, round, and track. It also shows how that reusable logic can support supplements, checklist groups, application pages, failures, bins, feeds, reports, and even status portal content. That is serious Forge work. But it also comes with risk. When you create business-defined joins, you are encoding institutional logic. That logic needs naming standards, documentation, null handling, testing, regression checks, and clear owner. Someone has to understand what happens when a program changes, a round changes, a track changes, or a dataset value is missing. The lesson is not everyone should build Sue joins. The lesson is that advanced query techniques are governance tools when used well, and future mysteries when used casually. The distinction matters. In the Technician's Query Grab Bag sessions from Luis and Max, it adds another layer. It covers independent subqueries, dictionary exports, query-based reporting, and parameters. The common thread is reuse. How do we avoid rebuilding the same logic every year? How do we structure multi-row outputs so Liquid can use them? How do we use parameters to make query logic evergreen? How do we compare rows when the base relationship is not simple? This is where query work starts to become platform architecture. A dictionary export is not just an output. It becomes structural material for Liquid and interfaces. A parameter is not just a trick. It makes a query adaptable without hard-coding cycle-specific logic. A reusable query pattern is not just convenient. It reduces the chance that 5 people build 5 slightly different versions of the same definition. If every campaign rebuilds its own version of high engagement, you don't have a signal strategy. If every report demonstrated interest differently, you do not have an analytical strategy. If every year-specific query hard-codes the cycle, you do not have durable infrastructure. Reusable query assets are the difference between one-off blade and a repeatable forging process. Now, this is where I want to step back from the techniques and name the institutional maturity path underneath them. A team cannot explain rogue grain while struggling with reliable reports. A team cannot explain subqueries while struggling with one-to-many logic. And a team that cannot reuse definitions will struggle with consistent strategy. And a team that cannot document advanced joins will struggle with secession. And a team that cannot teach query literacy will always be one resignation away from confusion. That's why query literacy is a workforce planning issue, not just a technical preference. A strong Slate office should have a shared vocabulary for query logic. Not everyone needs the same depth. A counselor may only need to understand enough to interpret a list. A communications builder may need to understand populations, exclusions, joins, and one-to-many risks. An analyst may need to understand query bases, aggregates, subqueries, and reusable definitions. And an advanced Slate developer may need independent subqueries, dictionary exports, parameters, query libraries, and performance testing. But they all benefit from the same vocabulary. Let me make this concrete. Suppose your communications team wants to send a campaign to admitted students who attended an admitted student event but have not deposited. That sounds easy. But the query has to decide whether the communication is person-based or application-based. It has to decide whether event registration counts or only attendance. It has to decide whether all admitted student events count or only certain event populations. It has to know whether the event record is tied to the person while the deposit is tied to the application. It has to handle students who deposited after the query ran. This is not just query logic, this is communications governance. The query determines who receives the language. If the join logic is wrong, the message strategy is wrong. Or take the counselor priority lists. Leadership wants a weekly list of admitted students with high engagement and no deposit. Simple idea, but the query has to define engagement. Portal logins, event attendance, email clicks, ping activity, interview, FAFSA, parent engagement. These are not interchangeable signals. Then it has to decide the rogue grain. 1 student per counselor, 1 application, 1 student per major. What happens if the student has multiple interests, multiple territories, or multiple event records? The counselor does not need to know every technical detail, but someone needs to be able to explain the logic. Otherwise, the list becomes a black box, and black boxes are dangerous in yield work. For analytics, query literacy is the difference between interesting tabs and trustworthy analysis. If you are comparing inquiry to application, application to admit, admit to deposit, and event behavior across cycles, the bases matter, timing matters, entry points matter, source logic matters, deduping matters, registration versus attendance matters, person level versus application level outcomes matter. If those definitions drift, the analysis gets softer. It may still look polished, but polished is not the same as reliable. For predictive modeling, this becomes even more important. A model is only as good as the features feeding it. If a feature says attended event, the model inherits whatever the query means. Any event ever? Recruitment events, post-admit events, in-person only, virtual, student attended, guest attended, registered but no showed? If a feature says email click, which clicks count? All clicks, high intent links, parent clicks, student clicks, pre-admit clicks, post-admit clicks? The model may be built in SPSS, Python, Excel, or another tool, but the raw material often comes from Slate. If the query logic is unstable, the model inherits the instability. The forge work starts before the model. It starts when you decide what the data actually means. Now, a caution. Query literacy does not mean everyone gets unlimited query access. That could, would, should be a bad interpretation. Some bases are sensitive. Some data should be permissioned tightly. Some users should be guided through safe reviews, shared reports, or defined populations. Query literacy and governance go together. Sometimes the best way to support less technical users is not to expose everything, It's to create guardrails. Advanced query techniques can also create technical debt. Independent subqueries, comparison logic, dictionary exports, parameters, and reusable libraries are powerful. But power is not the same as maintainable. If only one person understands a complex query, it needs documentation. If the query drives rules, checklists, portals, bins, communications, or models, it needs testing. If a parameter changes annually, it needs an owner. If a dictionary export feeds liquid, someone needs to understand both the query and the rendering logic. There's also a difference between learning the concept and copying the build. Do not look at a join named Sue, and think we need Sue joins everywhere. That's not the lesson. The lesson is recognize when a business-defined relationship is needed, and then build it carefully. Do not look at query grab bag and think every query needs parameters. The lesson is to use parameters where reusable logic benefits from controlled variability. Do not look at subquery sessions and think subqueries are always better. The lesson is to understand when the data shape requires them. So, what should a team actually do with this? I would start by building a query ladder for your office. At the bottom, record bases and row grain. Then direct joins and one-to-one relationships, then one-to-many relationships and why duplicates happen, then subquery filters and exports, then aggregates, rankings, and testing, then independent subqueries and business-defined comparisons, then reusable assets, the query libraries, dictionaries, parameters, materialized views, and documentation. You do not need to train everyone at the same level, but you should know what each role needs. A counselor may need to understand the row grain of the reports they use. A communications builder may need to understand population logic and one-to-many risk. An analyst may need to understand subqueries, aggregates, and data validation. An advanced builder may need to understand reusable structures and performance consequences. This is a more realistic training model than everyone should learn queries, or only one person touches queries. The second move is simple. Add a row grain sentence to important query documentation. One row represents a person, one row represents an application, one row represents a decision, one row represents an event registration. Then you have to add why the base was chosen. You can see the base of the query, but you need to know the why. It might feel basic. Good. Basic things are often the load-bearing beams. The third move is to label joins like you are leaving instructions for a future coworker. Do not label a join school if what you mean is rank 1 school for current application review. Do not label a join address if what you mean is current mailing address for communication audiences, or all active addresses for geographic eligibility checks. The label should tell future you why the join exists. And the fourth move is to build a query review habit. Before a query drives a major communication, dashboard, rule, model, or leadership report, someone should review the base, the row grain, the one-to-many relationships, the exclusions, the sensitive data exposure, the places where Slate is selecting from one row from many. This does not need to become a committee meeting. It can be a 15-minute peer review. The value is consistency. And the fifth move is to create a trusted query pattern library. Every institution has patterns that recur. Admitted but not deposited, registered but did not attend, attended a high intent event, complete application with missing financial aid steps, high engagement but no response, students with many address in a region, students whose latest decision meets a condition. Instead of rebuilding these from scratch every cycle, create trusted patterns. Document the base, document the row grain, document the logic, and document when not to use the pattern. The last part matters. A trusted pattern should include a warning label. This pattern is person-based. Do not use it when you need one row per application. This pattern checks any addresses. Do not use it when you need current mailing address only. This pattern identifies attendance, not registration. This is how you turn query skills into institutional infrastructure. If you're going to study the featured sessions, I would use them in this order. Start with fantastic data and where to find it from Christy and Claire. Use to ground new users in tables, bases, joins, relationships, and query efficiency. Then study, yes, you need to know configurable joins from Danielle, Laura, and Paula. Use it to teach vocabulary and row grain. Then go to But Why Subqueries by Jason Use it to explain why one-to-many data creates problems and when subqueries become necessary. Then study a join named Sue from Charles. Use it for advanced builders who need to understand business-defined relationships and controlled comparison logic. Then study query grab bag from Luis and Max. Use it for advanced query builders who are ready for reusable techniques like independent subqueries, dictionaries, query-based reporting, and parameters. And that's the path. It moves from understanding the data world to asking better questions, to choosing better bases, to handling many related rows, to creating reusable advanced logic. That is the query ladder. The argument today is simple. Query literacy is now part of the professional craft of Slate. Not because everyone needs to become a master query builder, because institutions are making decisions based on query outputs every day. Who gets a message? Who appears on a list? Who is counted in a funnel? Who triggers a workflow? Who is considered engaged? Who is flagged for follow-up? Who's missing from the report entirely? That means query logic is not just technical logic, it's institutional logic. And institutional logic should not live in one person's head. So, here's the next step. Pick one important query that your office uses. Open it. Don't change anything yet. Just write down what one row represents, why the base was chosen, where the query touches one-to-many data, and whether any other person could explain it 6 months from now. If the answer to the last question is no, you found your next training artifact. Go study the feature sessions. Start with fantastic data and where to find it. Then, yes, you need to know configurable joins. Then, but why subqueries? And then join named Sue. And then query grab bag. And if you are following the companion LinkedIn series, look for the post called Query Literacy is Now Table Stakes. I will also be building this into a query ladder worksheet for the conference Insights Engine, because the goal is not to make querying feel mysterious. The goal is to make the work teachable. That is the Forge work. Thanks for listening to the conference Insights Engine, presented by the Innovation Forge. Now go write the row grain sentence for one query.